When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is episode 139, HTML, CSS, JS. Straight to the point with that one. I'm Matt, that's Mike, and this week we'll be going back to basics and giving an overview of those languages, HTML, CSS, and JS. Now, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And now, this is a Mike-heavy episode, but we have some debates planned and some interesting points to bring up. So if you want to join in, just want to put this in the forefront here. If you have anything to add to the debate, and you'll know the debate in a minute, or when in the show, not in literally a minute. But if you have anything to add to the debate, feel free to hit us up on the social media. Please keep it civil, because this is a technical debate. We're not debating anything too serious here. So there may be some debates and some things that you disagree with or agree with, and feel free to hit us up on the socials. So Mike, please, sir, take us into the basics.
Okay. So the reason I kind of wanted to talk about this is I feel like we've been doing a lot of talk about a lot of newer technologies, like stuff built on top of JavaScript or whatever, or frameworks for CSS like Tailwind and all that. And we haven't kind of gone back in a while and talked about something that's kind of really important to our theory of educating yourself, which is learning the big three, like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, to then further your career and be able to pick up all the other stuff a lot easier. And I just wanted to have an episode where we kind of go back and discuss just like, what is a HTML? What like, when is it used? What is it used for? What is CSS? When is it used? What is it used for? And the same thing with JavaScript. And in that order specifically as well, because a few episodes ago, we talked about like, how is it best to learn? And there's a reason why like HTML first, CSS second, and JavaScript third. It's because of that like little theory that Killian, I think, brought up before, where learning the tool with the least complexity that can do the job, instead of learning the tool with the most complexity that can also do that job, but with a lot more overhead. So like, if you're doing stuff in JavaScript that can be done in HTML, it doesn't really make sense to do that, because JavaScript usually will perform worse, usually isn't read the same with other stuff like accessibility tooling and stuff like that. So it's better to use the tools that were designed for the thing that you're doing, and learn that way so that you get the best practices right away, rather than kind of the opposite. And I say this, but like for myself, I was more well-versed in JavaScript than I was in HTML starting out. So now I'm kind of going back and learning HTML a little bit better, learning CSS a little bit better to bring myself up to the same standards that I'm going to be talking about here with you. So with that, I think we'll just jump right into HTML. So the structure of your web page will be created with HTML. That's the point of HTML. It's to create the structure of your web page. The page semantics should be driven from HTML elements. And what do I mean by page semantics? I mean like the logical structure, the logical components on the page, like forms, buttons, headings, articles, videos, images, lists, navigation, all that kind of stuff should be very clearly identified by the HTML elements that represent them. So like when I say form, there's actual form HTML elements, like input elements, checkbox elements, all that. They're already there for you. They already have some basic functionality there for you already out of the box. Just use them when you need to use a form. Button, same thing. Like when you have a button, and a button, here's one question I have for you, Matt, right off the bat. Let's say you have a link, right? And that's an ahref. And a button. Do you ever use buttons for links, or are you always using an a tag if there's a link to like a separate section on a site?
Right off the top of my head, every situation is different, but in general, I usually do an A tag and buttons in forms specifically.
Right.
That's
Right,
just what I reach for. Now, I know I could do something different, but that's just what I do.
I think that's the right way to do it. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring it up is like there are like a button can definitely send you to another page, right? Like a button tag, you can give it the functionality of an href, 100% doable. But an anchor tag already has that functionality built in. You don't have to do anything special with it. Like you don't have to, link it with JavaScript. You don't have to do a programmatic navigation with an A tag. So when it's just a link, you got to use just an A tag. When it's a button is like you're submitting a form, you're doing some sort of functionality like popping up a module, you're manipulating some data and outputting some sort of conclusion. Those things are buttons. So that's what I mean by the semantics. So like when you're designing the logic of your page, use the proper HTML tags that fit with the logic. Like I said, there's like the headings tag. Headings is another big one as well, actually. Something that I've noticed that I've not struggled with, but didn't even know about until like a few weeks ago even. Every single HTML page should only have one H1 tag to represent its actual, like, this is what this HTML page is about. Like if the HTML page is a contact us form, then the H1 tag would be the contact us. Right? So that when a screen reader is reading it or when an SEO engine, like a search engine crawler is reading it, it knows exactly what that page is about right away. If you have multiple H1 tags on a page, right, then it can kind of muddy the waters for the crawlers and for the accessibility readers, screen readers. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. I think if you have a single page website where you have, the contact us form, the about us page and everything all on the same page, I believe, and don't quote me on this, is something that I'm still trying to figure out. And if someone has an answer for this, let me know. I believe each one of those sections can be an H1 tag, but usually it's one H1 tag per page. And then like up to, 4, maybe 6 H2 tags, depending on each section. So each section should have its own H2 tag. And you shouldn't have and then after that, you kind of go down to H3 and H4 and H5 as you break it up. But they're not, the H tags aren't really designed to be the styling of the thing. It's actually designed to be the semantics of the page, if that makes sense. So with that, there's obviously a bunch of other tags like videos, images, lists, navigation, all that kind of stuff. Like there's literally way more than that even. Stuff like I think articles and sections and stuff like that. Like there's so much that I've never even used. But apparently, like again, you're using them will make it a lot easier for accessibility tools and search engine routers to understand what your page is about right off the bat without even having to guess what this paragraph is about and without having to guess what like the whole concept of your website is about. It can just use your HTML semantics to have a good idea right off the bat.
Well, here's the thing too is so I've been a few weeks ago, like I kind of just dabble in like research at night type of thing, and like I'll research different things that I'm interested in that like can't be on the forefront of what I'm doing, and like just due to time. And so I just started sort of dabbling in, because I've mentioned this 1,000 times that I'm like a jack of all trades. I have to jump around so much that I can never master or even really get good at a lot of different things because I'm just running around being multiple hats in the company. And I started like looking up more. I don't know really what I was searching for at this point. I think it was like more simplistic ways to do things, more proper ways, I suppose, to do things, because one of the things that Mike and I are looking at getting into is just sort of getting a little bit of passive income going from possibly selling templates down the road or something like that. And so I was like, okay, like, I go out and I build a customer's website out, whether it's with a template or not, depending on what their budget is and whatever. I build it out, I get it to them, they're happy with it, and then that's it. But the thing is that I'm never as confident in what I build if the person wants fully custom. I'm not confident in it enough to say, hey, you know what? I could bundle this up and sell this as a template. I always feel as though the templates are better put together than what I put together. Now, that is and isn't true, I'm sure. There's some things that the template guys are doing because they're used to building templates, but there's probably some stuff that I'm doing better, probably some stuff they're doing better, because even when you download templates, there's issues in them. Now, the reason why I even mention all this is it kind of led me down the rabbit hole of YouTube, as searching things do, where a lot of people were talking about, and we'll get into this throughout the episode, talking about boiling things down to their most simplistic, but also the most, I suppose, direct, I'm paraphrasing, way to do it. And so that is where the different HTML tags kind of come in. You can do almost anything you want with a div. You can do divs here and nested divs and divs over there and divs here. And sometimes you get pulled in a direction, like if you need to do forms and stuff like that, like you need to do specific tags within the forms and that type of thing. But in general, for visual elements on the screen, you really can, nest 1,000 divs into one another and stuff like this. And that, what I'm learning is, and it wasn't like I was doing that for the most part.
I was.
You were, but the thing is that like I would reach for a div first, and now I'm reaching for the respective tag first. So the thing is that like I'm learning that like less is more, and you should just boil it down so that your HTML, again, I'm paraphrasing these videos because there were several, basically boil it down to be the most simplistic layout, because that's what the HTML is for, the most simplistic layout, so that I can look at it and say, oh, this is a div, fair enough. This is a div, it's a content block. Inside of the div has a video. Like, instead of me being like, what's this link here? And like try to figure out what the hell's going on, because I like hacked the div to do this and that with CSS and everything else. It's more simplistic to have like, oh, here's my nav tags. Clearly this is my nav bar. Stuff like that. And whereas a lot of the time I was using the correct tags, a lot of the time, I wasn't. And so I understand like, oh, there's function behind these things, and it helps accessibility. So why wouldn't you do this? But this comes back to that thing that we had a talk with, I think it was Killian actually, where, when you're a person that's learning right off the bat, you can't have like the book thrown at you figuratively. You can't be like hitting the HTML, the CSS, the JS, the accessibility, the responsive. There's no way. And so like, because something like accessibility, something like proper formatting, something like using the proper tags comes with time, comes with skill, comes with practice. And there's no way you're going to be able to do all that, because the instant you learn the power of a div, you're probably going to be like us and just rip in there with a div. Now, I've been, like I said, using that less and less and trying to use more simplistic systems, or more recently, I've been using a fair bit of templates, which handle that for me. But the thing is like you need to keep in mind that HTML, where it is the layout, where it is, I would say, the most simplistic of these three, or one of the more simplistic things, it's still something that needs to be considered for accessibility, but also for readability, for you going back to the code, for other team members going back to the code. You really just need to boil it down so that you're not being like div, class, navbar, which I've done a million times. You need to start using things like the proper navbar tags. And that way it helps, like Mike said, the accessibility, but it also helps you. And I'm just reiterating at this point, but it also helps you if you're going back. You're not like Control F. Where's the navbar class? Like, where the nav is. And if you have an IDE that's set up, to read HTML, you can collapse your navbar probably to be like, oh, I don't need to touch my navbar. I'm just trying to fix this content block. And you can just collapse the navbar, quickly visually, and you can see exactly where it is. But if you have a class that's like, div class navbar, sure, it might be easy enough to find. But what happens when someone doesn't name it that? What if someone names it nav? What if someone names it bar? What if someone names it navigation in the class name, right? It's up to them. Then you have a problem where you're like, where the hell is the nav bar? That can happen. That can get buried in complex projects. And so really boiling it down to the most simplistic and most direct solution is oftentimes the best for pretty much everything.
Yep. Keep it simple, stupid.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
That's the attitude. And I think like for us, when we were starting out, we didn't have that mindset of like, let's learn the semantics of HTML. So that's why we kind of went down the rabbit hole of a div within a div within a div, and then a div here and a div here, and like maybe an H1 tag here and there and stuff like that. We were very sporadic with our semantic HTML use. There was a couple reasons for that. And I was going to touch on this on the CSS side, but the great thing about being in web development now is that Internet Explorer 11 is being phased out, which means that stuff like CSS Grid and Flexbox fully supported everywhere, right? So when you're writing HTML now, you don't need those container divs anymore, like you did before with like all the, display block centering and all that. Like you needed a lot of container divs to achieve that. At least starting out, like eventually you got really good at it and you can whittle it down. But that was the idea, especially with Bootstrap. But nowadays, you can write a page that's just semantic HTML without like almost any divs at all, because of the fact that you can just put it in a grid. Make sure that, this is a container, this is that, and just put it in a CSS grid and lay it out however the heck you want, right from the CSS, and change it up on mobile view and all that. So it provides so much flexibility and so much clean HTML code that it's easier, in my opinion, if you're starting out right now, or if you're going back to learn a little bit more basics. Learning the semantics HTML will make it easier for you to go down and learn all the other stuff and make your pages a lot easier, rather than going through the div hell that we kind of went through. And I'm still like kind of in it. I'm the same as Matt. I'm trying to get out of it right now, going back to the basics. That's why we're doing this episode. But yeah, I was definitely a diver, or whatever you want to call the people that just use divs for everything, right? And
is there a name? Like I was going to say, is somebody
I was trying to find one, but I'm trying to coin one right now as diver, I guess. I was a diver. And now I'm trying to get out of that way, because going back to it, like the cleaner the code that you have, let's remove accessibility from like even your mind, because like Matt said, it's really hard to like focus on a million different things at once. If you create this like clean semantic code, you don't even have to worry about accessibility for the most part, at least when you're starting out, because it handles it for you. And not only that, it'll handle this some of the SEO stuff for you, and maintainability. If you come back to the code base 2 years later, you'll know exactly what that page is about. Or if you give that code base to someone else, they know exactly what it's about. Like,
or at least like get a good feeling. Like the main thing is the feeling, right? Because if they can't find the damn nav bar, now you got a problem. Now it's like, where the fuck is this nav bar? There's 3 types of nav bar on this site for the different responsivities. Where the hell is this thing? That's just wasted time. And the thing, and the reason why I like hopped in there is because some of these pages, like even though some people will say, quote unquote, that's just HTML, some of these pages can get pretty damn complex in layout. Like there's a lot in these pages. Things can get buried easily. And really like just at least getting the idea of where to look is like super important, because a lot of these sites will sit idle for a long time. A lot of these sites will not be maintained for a long time or updated, like the HTML files themselves. And when you do have to go in there, I mean, you're going to be kind of struggling trying to get into an old code base anyway. The big target is, don't try to keep it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that don't try to fight complexity to the point where you're literally removing features. Sometimes files, whatever they are, HTML, CSS, JS, will become complex. Just fight needless complexity is what I guess I'm trying to say. Because what you're really trying to do is get like the original, the initial vibe. Like I open the file, I like poke around a little bit, and I kind of know what's going on. But we all know that sometimes let's say you have to dive into like a WordPress plugin, or like a really bizarre WordPress issue, and you're like bouncing around like, where the hell, like even just visually without the code, like where the hell is this menu? Like where do I change this? Like I've changed it here, but that didn't do it. Is it in the settings? Like where, and you're just like, where the hell do I change this? And that's the same mentality that you have with something like HTML and stuff like that. So sometimes the complexity is needed if the complexity is needed in features, but try not to just add complexity to something like a button for no reason.
Absolutely. Exactly. So that's kind of it for HTML. I think like, again, main points are, it's the semantics. So you got the logic of your page layout, and just so that accessibility, SEO, and maintainability in the future. Learning the basics, the semantics of it first, will give you a better idea of then going into the next part, which is the CSS. And CSS is used to take that structure that you just created with HTML and style it, make it look good, and make it functional across different screen sizes and devices, right? I already mentioned that like before, CSS was a little bit more of a chunky tool because of the whole Internet Explorer 11, or the older Internet Explorer issues where you couldn't use flexbox and you couldn't use grid. Nowadays, in my opinion, CSS has become kind of fun. It's become kind of the thing that like you want to reach for and you want to play around with because there's just so many tools available for you. CSS with flexbox and grid being mainly supported in every single browser, including mobile browsers, it's kind of like mobile layouts are kind of a joke at this point. Centering a div, it used to be the joke in web development. Like every forum or every meme page or whatever you would go to would be like, what's the hardest thing to do in web development? Centering a div, et cetera, et cetera. And like for good reason. There was like clear fixes, there was floats, there was like all this crap just to center a div. In margin auto, like centering a div with the block method, although you could get good at it at some point, it was still this weird like conditional thing where like sometimes you would do a margin auto, sometimes you do a margin zero auto, sometimes you would do a clear fix here, a clear fix there. Like it was just such a weird situation that it was difficult. And I don't know how many times I asked you, Matt, like, this isn't centering, can you please help me here? Because like you were better at CSS than me.
Well, that's the thing too, is like I maybe to a fault, I just never use floats. I just hate them. I will, like, I shouldn't say never, but I rarely use floats because I just hate seeing clear fixes everywhere. Like people are like, hey, like, why isn't this centering all of a sudden? Like it's still doing this. And then people are like, well, have you done a clear fix? It's like, come on, man. Like, why is there always a freaking clear fix? Like that'd be like a clear fix to me is like the equivalent of being like, oh, I started my car once. I guess I better get the oil changed every fucking time. Like, come on, man.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Or like majiggering the key every single time or something like that. Like just doing something weird little thing that shouldn't be part of the actual process because the clear fix is not, right? Like it's literally a fix that you have to do almost every time, but sometimes no. Like that's the thing that killed me.
That's the thing that's the thing that gets complex is sometimes a clear fix, like you forget it and it doesn't matter. But then way down the page, all of a sudden, oh my God, I need a clear fix.
Yep.
And like I'm not even an expert in that. I just literally saw that noise and was like, you know what? I'm just gonna, and again, possibly to a fault, I'm just not gonna use floats as much as I can.
Yep. And you were right to do that for the most part because like they were a pain to work with. I used them every once in a while and I hated them. But again, once Flexbox came on the table and like everyone supported it, Justify Content Center, Align Item Center, you're done. Like that, literally anything can be centered with those two lines. In the middle of a page or in the middle of a div or in the middle of a container, and you could center horizontally and vertically. That was another whole issue, like centering horizontally or centering vertically was kind of a problem, or actually not even kind of a problem. It was a serious problem with the block method.
Yeah, it was a serious problem.
Yeah, it was like you have to use like percents and stuff like that. And I like sometimes I would have to actually calculate like in the middle of the image. Sometimes I would have to calculate the middle of the image and center it like based on the percent of the page. It was, I don't know if I was doing it wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was the right way to do it at that time. It was a disaster. Justify Content Center, done. Like you are fully finished with centering your object. Move on to something else. It's great. But again, like that's the evolution of this stuff. And that's why like learning CSS now is a good experience. You lay out your page great with the HTML that we just talked about. Then you go in and you kind of just use the tools that are available for you. Like I said, Flexbox and Grid and the CSS, quickly get the layout done. And then you move on to the more complex stuff, right? And the more complex stuff with CSS usually is something like CSS animations. And this is something that also has gotten better over time, has required less use of libraries, has required less use of JavaScript, because now you can do a lot of like stuff with keyframes. You can do a lot of stuff with the transitions and keyframe combinations. You can do stuff with selector effects. So like if you hover over something, start a keyframe, you can do a bunch of things without having to rely solely on JavaScript to even do like complex animations, like really nice, smooth animations when you're entering like a certain element, like a certain spot on the page you can do with CSS. You can do CSS on load and stuff like that. There's still things like that you would need to reach for in JavaScript, maybe like adding a class or removing a class sometimes. As simple as that could enable a lot more functionality with animations, but there's just so much that CSS animations can do, and they are pretty performative. Like, especially compared to like the jQuery animations that I was doing back in the day with like just show and hides or fade in, fade outs. They were a little bit chunky and like, they sometimes had some stuttering. Nowadays, it's really easy to set that up in CSS, have it perform really well across all devices, and not have to even touch JavaScript.
Now here's a question for you actually, Mike. So like, keyframes and stuff like that, that's great. And I agree, CSS, you can get in there and like really kind of like get the bulk of it done, the layout, and then you have that polish phase. So that's kind of what I want to talk about, is that polish phase. So the polish phase, like Mike touched on, is the transitions, maybe even changing things like, hey, this looks kind of weird, whatever. And there's like, but it's like making it nice. Maybe there's fade ins, maybe there's fade outs, or, better hover effects, doesn't matter. So I want to ask you kind of a question, Mike. So I have a problem, and this is not just with stuff that I build. This is with just stuff like other websites that I see, whatever. And this is on phones, like my phones, my computers. I have a couple computers, whatever. I have like terrible CSS animation performance. But here's the thing. I get it to an extent. So if let's say I load in and just to total simplistic, a red circle is going to go from left to right. Far left of the screen, right to the, like, that's it. So I do keyframes, I can do transition. I don't care how you do it. I have a major stutter at about 20% of that ball going across the screen, that circle going across the screen. And I have that, and that's not just me. Like, that is not just stuff that I'm putting together. That is just like animations in general. And you could say, okay, well, your one computer's old. That's great. So you go to a new computer, that's still doing it. You go to my iPad, it's still doing it. You go to this thing, which is my Galaxy, that's still doing it. Now, I don't know, and when you refresh, it's fine. It's sort of like that cache effect, whatever, depending on how the site's set up. So, I don't know. I know that back in the day, whether it's still valid, I haven't done CSS animations in a while, just haven't needed them. I know that you used to do like the translate 3D and then like 000 to initiate, like get the GPU involved. It would, even though it's like not actually translating anything, it'd be like, oh, 3D, and then you like kind of call in the GPU, which is the graphical processing unit, graphics card for you if you don't know, which would then like, help that. But here's the thing, in a canvas, I have no problems. If that was just a canvas and it rolls across first time, boom, it works every single time. Now, I don't know whether it's an internet connection thing, because like obviously that's one of the commonalities, whether it's, I was going to say whether it's Edge, but like I had it in Chrome too, and now they're both Chromium based. So I don't know. Like, is there something that I'm missing and other people are missing? Because I don't see this on every other site, but I do see it where randomly I fade in will like flicker. And then the reason why I even bring this up is because now that polish phase looks clunky. The thing is that something looks clunky without polish, but if the polish looks clunky, it looks worse, in my opinion. So how do you combat that? Or is this just, am I crazy? Like, is it just been a while and I need to go back to it? Like, what's going on here?
So it depends really. Like the reason that those stutters happen on initial load and not on refresh indicates to me that there's a lot of stuff loading in the background that's single threaded, right? So when you don't enable the GPU acceleration, the animation is running in the same thread that all the stuff that like all your XML HTTP requests, all your AJAX, like all your requests that are loading, all your images that are downloading, all that is happening at the same time, at the same exact second as your transition. So that could cause it. And then when you refresh, everything's from cache. It's a lot faster, so everything's fine, right? That's most likely what's happening. Now, depending on how you've tested it or not tested it, if you just like literally threw HTML and CSS together, one page, no loads, nothing, no scripts, and it's still happening for you across all devices, then that's a different issue. And that really shouldn't be happening as far as I've tested before. Like almost all of my recent animation work that I've done, and it's been like hit or miss. Or not hit or miss, but like far and few between. But I have done a little bit of it, like fades and slides and stuff like that. it's been really smooth. And mostly that's because I'm trying to do as little as possible during the loading stages as I can. So I'm trying to remove the use of a million libraries. And I think that's what affects a lot of websites. So like websites that have that initial load spike will have slower initial animations. Is that something that would explain it for you, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I just had a thought when you were talking there that I am using the same web server for all my tests. Now, I realize that the web page is effectively being downloaded to my computer, but I wonder if that web server is hiccuping. Now, actually, no, because that's wrong, because I keep bringing it back to animations that I'm doing, that I'm testing with, but it's happening on other stuff too. A good example would be not now, and this is maybe why they changed it, but the old Webflow site. So not one that I built, like literally the Webflow site. It had all these animations and stuff like this to sort of show it off. And as scrolling down on a phone, on my, I don't think I had a tablet at the time, but on my phone for sure, on my computer, and I had a couple computers, it just was really bad. And sometimes the fans would kick on and stuff like this. And it just seemed to be really particularly bad. Now, I have done a small amount of research into this because my fades are fine, stuff like that. But it's mostly, or entirely, because like I said, it's been a while, so like this issue could just be gone now. But I have only really noticed it, or in my memory, I really noticed it in when I move something. And some people were saying in my research that what's happening is the page is trying to calculate if it needs to change the flow, or if it needs to move stuff around. And even if it doesn't, it still does those calculations to like check. Now, I don't know if that's true. I could be a complete idiot, to be totally blunt. You might be listening to this and rolling your eyes being like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I have not done anything short of fade in and fade out and hover effects for quite a while, just due to the fact that I haven't needed them. But again, I don't know. I don't know whether it's just me, because the thing is that I'm a fan of the polished look, where you know how when you have like an app that's being advertised to you on, say, something like Instagram, and you know how they like, a good example is that new Birdhouse thing that's come out, where it's called like Bird Buddy or something, and they like, it's like it's on Indiegogo, and it's like a birdhouse that like a bird will land on it. It's a picture. There's a camera there, and there's an app that shows up, and it'll say like, "Hey, you have somebody visiting your bird thing," and you can like take a picture and stuff. Like, I'm not gonna get into it. The point of the matter is the app demo they show is like super smooth. And whereas I realize there might be glitches and outages and stuff like this, I would like the actual performance when everything is up to be smooth like that, because it's like, it's not like I'm initiating a weird motion. I'm saying, hey, move this red circle to left or right. And it's just like, and goes about 20%, and little like skip frame, and then it keeps going.
Yeah, it's strange.
Now, like I said, this has been a long damn time since I've really tried it. It could have been something like, because I was also learning back then too, so it could have been something I was doing wrong. Or what, I don't know. Obviously, there's limitations to CSS animations to a point. Like, there's a reason why Canvas exists. Like, you don't want to have like fucking things flying in like crazy, right? That's fine. Do your own testing and figure out what your limits are. But the thing is I don't know. That was always my experience with CSS animations, and having been away from them for probably over a year now, I haven't really noticed it, obviously. But I'm just wondering whether I was crazy. Maybe I still am. Maybe I still am crazy. But that was my experience. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's just like you were looking too closely at it or not, but I haven't noticed that for a while. So maybe it's a good experiment for you to go back and just get like a red, ball to roll across the screen or something, and see if that has any issues for you. Because I know they're like, browsers have been doing a lot of work to make animation smooth year over year. So maybe that improvement will help you there. But other than that, like, for the most part, for me personally, the animations that I've used have been pretty smooth. I haven't done too many of those slide animations that you're talking about. I've done a little bit, just like sliding a nav bar in and out. And as far as I can see, it's pretty damn smooth. But I don't look at it as closely as you do, I don't think. So it could skip a frame here and there. I'm not sure. Yeah,
because the thing is I've done those. That's a common one where you pop in on a really data heavy site, oftentimes I'll use, some my designs, I'll use like a vertical navbar. And what I do is I have it slide in and out, and I can hide it so that there's just like a little navicon there, like a hide menu button, so that the people can, because it's data heavy, will be able to view the data with the majority of the screen being the data, of course, right? Because the data is important, data heavy site. So then I will have that come in, and the first time that thing flies in, it like skips a beat. Now you're right, like it could be just me being like, hey, what was that? And then it's smooth after every single one. To be totally honest, like I wonder if I did this because I've upgraded my internet in recent years twice. Like maybe it was my internet. Maybe it was, I did upgrade my computer once. Maybe it was my computer. It could have been something, stupid like that where I just didn't notice it. The last like year and a half feels like it's been like a month, but also 100 years. So like, I can't really tell you when, like my perception of time is over. Like it's already gone. I don't have any perception of time, so I can't tell you exactly when this was. This could have been 7 years ago. Like, for all I know, I don't remember, to be honest. I mean, I have done Webflow animations. Like, I have done Webflow animations, and those have been fine. So maybe I'm just...
I think it's time for you to kind of delve back into it and just let us know. Maybe keep us updated.
Maybe that's what I need to do, yeah.
Just do it again over the next, like, couple weeks, and then just, like, message on Twitter. And let everyone know what you think. Because, again, I haven't seen that issue in a long time. I think it's been solved.
And whether that was on my end or not.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows?
Like, I'm a common denominator. My internet's obviously a common denominator. Devices aren't common. Yeah. But the browser is. Mm-hmm. So, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? But yeah, with that, like I said, there's a lot of stuff you can do with this with CSS animations. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with other, like... class and ID targeting with like selector targeting. That's really cool that I haven't really delved a lot into, but like, you can target every nth element of this class with this type and then do something with that element, like style it in a certain way or make it animate, whatever you want to do. You can target stuff like this one was actually interesting. You can target stuff like an href, like an anchor tag with an href attribute that begins with HTTPS. All in CSS, and then do something with it. So like if you see a HTTPS like in an href, maybe put like a little lock beside it. You can do that with just pure CSS. You don't have to use JavaScript for that. I thought that was pretty cool. And there's a lot more of that kind of stuff, like targeting certain elements and doing something like showing or hiding or whatever, based on if they have something or if they don't have something, or if they're the like 10th of something or the 5th of something, whatever. A lot of really cool selectors that I would usually like, reach for JavaScript for something like that. But what this is telling me is I should go back and learn a little bit more of these tags, a little bit more of this element targeting that CSS already has out of the box. Because if CSS can do it, that means it can do it probably more efficiently. It probably can do it a lot clearer for the person that's reading it. And I don't have to like spin up a whole, JavaScript function just to be able to target the, every third element or something. Which obviously JavaScript can also do. That's why I'm kind of comparing it one-to-one there.
It's kind of interesting that CSS has kind of gone from, you would see people almost like edge cases or like just as experiments or whatever, be like, oh, I'm just going to do this with all CSS. And that was always considered like, oh, you're kind of hacking it together, or hey, this demo only works in Chrome. And it was just like almost like cool code pens back in the day. Like, hey, look at this. I did this with only CSS. Now, like some of those features are there, and they're like things that you can sort of quote unquote legitimately use or use across browsers now. Like support has gone up. So it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see how some of the stuff has been, say, stolen from JS to almost make it more simplistic. Because it's like kind of doing the hierarchy, right? HTML is kind of the most simplistic. CSS is like the second most, and then JS is like the most complex. So it's kind of like some stuff was stolen. It's weird. It's like some stuff was stolen from the most complex to put it into the middle complex, like the mid complexity one, to make it so that we can use less complex things to do complex things, which makes sense, but it's also kind of strange. And you can see how like developers can quote unquote age as well. Because like me, I'm just going to go do a bunch of crap in JS probably because I don't update myself all the time. As I said, I run around like a fool. So then people will be like, hey, what the hell? You could just do this in CSS. And I'll be like, I don't friggin' know. Like, so you can see how like updating yourself, especially in an industry that moves as quickly as web development, is super important. But at the same time, you can also see the allure of libraries.
Yes.
And it's this. it's this, and the allure of templates, it's this. And so you don't have to deal with the updating.
Yeah, it absolutely has like the complexity of the thing, but I think it is going towards a common denominator of making it easier and more stable. Because again, like back in the day, the changes were so drastic and quick. Now, in my opinion, it's kind of slowing down a little bit and becoming more stable. In which case, like, if you do learn this way now, it's probably going to stay this way in the future. Whereas before, like, everything was all up in the air because these browsers didn't support this. There's like 15 million browsers out there, Opera Mini, and they were all different. Like, there's just so much variety and stuff that you had to do to make stuff compatible that you had to use the lowest common denominator, which was like difficult to use, like all the block model and stuff like that. But nowadays it's becoming a lot more centralized. There's a lot to be said about like, competition and all that. There's not as much competition as there was, but there is, for developers in general, it is making it easier to kind of adapt and learn one system rather than learning 15 different systems and trying to adapt them all together, if that makes sense. But with that, CSS also has a couple of like new things that have come into play recently. And they're becoming really widely adapted to the point where like I'm pretty confident using them for development projects and like maybe not major like production projects, but for most production projects, I'd be okay with using them. Stuff like CSS variables is supported in all browsers now. So you can do, you can set all your colors in a separate application or a separate file, for instance. And then you just use those variables that you set, those CSS variables, in all your other files, so that when in the future you want to change a theme, all you have to do is just change those variables, and it completely goes across all of your different files, which is kind of cool. Like adding a little bit more of that like JavaScript style or programming style functionality to CSS, so you don't have to reach for JavaScript for every little thing. That's the idea of these things, just making it more convenient and less likely for you to need certain functionality in JavaScript. Because again, the point being, CSS will run more efficiently and easier and lighter than a JavaScript alternative, depending on the use case, obviously. But then there's also things called CSS modules, which is fairly new. So what this is that because ESM, so ES module support, is now being supported across all browsers, which means you can import things, and the browser is like, oh, I know what an import means. That's all that really means. You can actually have scoped CSS sheets inside of your browser. So you can have like a separate sheet, a separate file of CSS for every page, and whatever classes you use in that will be locally scoped to that page. So if you have, for instance, a large class in index.html and you import the index.css file sheet, right? That large class will only be taken from that index.css style sheet. So if you have that large class again, like .large in about.css and about.html, and it's different, like maybe one of them makes the div larger and one of them makes the text larger, they won't conflict. So you can have large in both those things. You can use like really standard, really basic CSS variable names across all your different pages and just have them in different sheets, and nothing will conflict because how ES modules will work. They'll just put like a ending tag on every one of those so that they're locally scoped, and that's it. And again, that's all handled by the browser. You don't need any build tools. Like before, this was easily accomplishable with build tools and like frameworks like React and Vue. They did this for you, locally scoping. But nowadays, you can actually do it in just basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is cool.
You know what's interesting about these complexities that are being added to, or these new functionality, I should say, not complexities, being added to CSS is that, I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but when we were like very, very, very beginning, before we were even really doing any professional work, I think, or maybe it was like just at the beginning of it, we were on the fence about what to use. Like we were like, is Flexbox valid? And it was difficult. I mean, as a beginner, it was difficult to tell what was valid. Like, do we use the box model, block model, whatever? Do you use Flexbox? Do you use CSS Grid? Wasn't a thing, but it was sort of like we ended up not using Flexbox for a while because it was very bizarre. It was a really bizarre feeling as a newbie coming into something because there isn't like a CSS marketing site out there where it's like, these are our features. Call this number and get like schedule a Zoom demo today and stuff like this. They don't have that. It's CSS is sort of, one of the foundational things, and therefore it's not clear. Maybe it is now, but I know for sure when you and I were looking, we were like, Flexbox, this Flexbox thing sounds like it can be done responsively, because we were trying to learn responsive design. I wonder if how to do this. And we ended up on CSS Tricks, the website I'm sure we've all used. And we ended up on CSS Tricks and we messing around on there. And it's like, I can't get this Flexbox thing to work. Let me look around. And then you look, and because it was at that period of time where a lot of the examples on Stack Overflow was using is it the box or the block model? I always forget. But anyway, we're using that model. It was like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be using Flexbox. Maybe it's literally, I think we said, maybe this is a fad or something that's an edge case. Maybe we shouldn't use it. And we didn't use it for a long time because there's ways to make any of the models, responsive with percentages and different widths and at media tags and all the rest of it. Sure. Now you can argue about efficiency in those, but it's possible. And I wonder as a beginner how these features and the features that, of yesteryear, I wonder how they cope with this. Where do you start as a CSS person that's brand new to CSS? Do you do the box or block model? Do you do the Flexbox? Do you do grid? Do you do where do you start? And there's a ton of ways to do stuff. Yep. That's the issue too, is that one Stack Overflow or any article from any site, Stack Overflow is just a really common one, can steer you the wrong direction. If you go and you look up, and I'm just making this up, you're like, how do I make a button? And someone has this crazy method of putting a button together in JS. And let's say it was for some edge case on some old browser or something, and there's the reason why it's crazy. But you're crazy by modern standards. But you're new. You don't know. And so you just go, oh, I guess that's how you make buttons. Now all your Google searches may be tainted by that, where now you're Googling in that context. So now you're getting answers which validates yourself, being like, oh yeah, of course you do this import and this and that and all this other stuff to import a button. What are you talking about? That can happen. And whereas, Mike and my situation, we just eventually learned Flexbox. It was just we just eventually was you know what, let's start using Flexbox. It wasn't that bad, but all my Google searches were not Flexbox from that day for at least a year. We weren't using Flexbox for responsive sites at that point, and we really, really could have been. And the thing is that it's hard to get a company, an agency, whatever, to change directions. Imagine being a person, because an agency is slow in this. Imagine being a person that doesn't have all the information. Agencies have a bunch of information and data and this and that they can look at, but they're slow moving. Imagine being a person, you're just a lone person. You're like, you know what? I really want to get hired by an agency. I'm going to try to practice CSS or whatever, HTML, JS, whatever it is. And you have all this at your disposal and you just miss something. It could be an honest mistake. And then maybe you don't interview well after that because maybe your interview skills are fine, but your actual skills were tainted by this. I'm seriously curious and there's no way for us to test this ourselves, but as a complete beginner, especially a complete beginner that was not in a tech field prior, how you handle it if you are doing self-taught. Boot camps and stuff like this, going to school, of course, is a solution, of course. But if you are a self-taught individual, how do you cut through the noise? This goes back to the whole thing of holy crap, there's all these different HTML tags and look at all this thing and I can import modules and I can animate, but what's the difference between an animation and a transition and should I be using that and should I, it just gets to the point where it's what are we doing here? And then that is where the people then turn to a library sometimes. And now they're just all in on jQuery or they're just all in on React or whatever, which is I'm not saying that's a problem, but I just wonder what the experience is today. Because back then it was Flexbox or not to Flexbox. Now it's do we import? Do we do this? Do we do grid? How's the grid doing? How's that working on IE? Do we use this? Does it do the mobile layout? How does it move over here? Do we have there's so many moving parts now. I just don't even know. I don't even know how we got started. We were lucky.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how the people get started now.
By listening to us.
I mean, yeah, I suppose.
Yes, but like, okay, so when we got started, Internet Explorer was still fairly popular, right? Like there was no, I don't think when we got started there was even Edge. Like I believe we were on. Like,
there was no Edge.
Yeah, when we first got started, it was either IE 10 or IE 11, right? So one of those two.
We were on 8. Like our latest OS at the time was 8.1, I believe.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's right. Because I had
so,
an
yeah.
insider build of Windows 10.
Right. And from Mohawk, right, from our college. Yeah.
No. Like I'm in the Windows Insider program.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So like I had like an insider meaning beta.
Yeah.
Version of Windows 10 that I was like playing with.
Yeah. So there was no Edge. There was no Edge at the time. And the problem was like when we were searching up Flexbox, when we were initially doing the first set of research to decide on display block or display flex, when Internet Explorer 10 kind of supported it. Like it supported it, but there was glitches. Internet Explorer 11 supported it a little bit better, but 6, like anything below 10 didn't support it at all. And that was still like a possibility for us. Like there's still some people on Internet Explorer like 9 and 8 and 7. Like there was still that thing. So we're like, well, we might as well go with the supported model, right? It's like we might as well go with block because that's supported in all the different browsers and that's where we're good to go. And that was the reason. Now, if you look it up now, like if you're a new developer and you're in the same spot that we were, and you look it up now, Internet Explorer 11 is barely used, right? And it supports Flexbox to an almost full degree, right? It's like its global usage right now is 0.94%. I'm on caniuse.com, just to like make something. Now Edge it's fully supported in Edge, right? So if you're thinking like you're supporting Edge, even the older before Chromium Edge, it's supported in that. So you're good there. It's supported in Chrome, it's supported in Safari, it's supported everywhere else. That's where you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to use it at this point. Like everyone's talking about Flexbox, everyone's using it, that's it. Whereas when we were doing it, it was kind of like Grid a couple of years ago, where like Grid was supported but not supported in some browsers. So you're like, well, I might use it for development projects, but I'm not going to use it for anything production because like, what if someone's using it on IE or something like that, or Edge even? I think Grid had like minor support in Edge, so you weren't going to pull for it. So it was again that toss up. Whereas the Flexbox model wasn't at that point. So you're like, okay, I'm going full into Flexbox. So that's the evolution of it. Like now Grid is at that point where you're like, oh, I can use Grid because it's supported in the latest version of Edge, like the latest version of Microsoft Edge and the latest version of Chromium Edge. It's supported in Safari and all that. Now is the point where I can cut off and learn Flexbox and Grid and be confident with it. That's not to say that like the block model is gone. Obviously, there's still probably some like small niche or like some agencies or some like niche applications out there that like rely on the block model. And there's not to say like you're going to learn Flexbox and Grid and then go to like a company that's just like all using block and you might be screwed. You can learn it. Like it's still learnable. It's still not like, it's not impossible to do block model. But for the most part, I would say you're pretty safe not learning it, in my opinion. Like, I don't think you should start on the block model and learn Flexbox and Grid. I think you should start on Flexbox and learn Grid, if that makes sense. Like, those should be your two things that you push for, and then everything else is kind of like you don't really need at this point.
And I would say this too is just as an interject here is I don't use Grid very much. I just haven't gotten around to really learning it much. I've used it here and there. I used it on stream once, but I've like really rarely used it. And you can do a lot with Flexbox. It's not like when you learn Flexbox, you're like, well, I better learn Grid before I start, selling sites or whatever. No, that's not the case. Like you can absolutely do pretty much everything you need to do with Flexbox. Flexbox is totally powerful, whatever. Some stuff still needs to use the block or box model still, but at this point, I really couldn't without a guide just pull up CSS Grid. Now that's, you could say like, why aren't you updating that's fine. The reason why I make that point is that you don't need to feel pressured to like jump right into Grid. You can just do Flexbox, get good at it, continue to master it, and then just slowly introduce Grid as you see fit.
Mm-hmm. And I think like, I don't think they stand apart. It's not like it's different than learning block model and Flex, because I think in my opinion, they stand apart. Like if you learn Flex, you almost never have to reach for block. Like I literally like the last 4 or 5 web pages that I built out, I haven't done anything in the block model unless it's like default. Like if it's just like a text box or something, I'll just leave it default without flex. But I could easily just throw flex on it. It'll be the exact same functionality. So anything that block can do, flex can do. Whereas grid is different. I think grid is something that you would use with flexbox rather than just learning it completely separately. Like flexbox and grid together make for a stupidly powerful combination whenever you get around to like learning it now that it's again supported in a bunch of browsers. I think it is important to kind of at least take a look at it again. But absolutely, flex can do almost everything that you want it to do without any sort of other thing. Like you don't need to learn grid to do almost anything. The only advantage I'd say that grid gives you is in responsivity. There's certain things that you literally can't do in block or flexbox that grid can do for responsivity. Like it can rearrange your elements based on like even their hierarchy, like putting something below something else just with grid. Whereas with flexbox, you would have to use something like either multiple divs and hiding one and showing one, or JS with like, ripping something out and putting something there to achieve the same functionality. But
now, I will say one thing. First of all, we're both fools. It's CSS box model, so we're both fools. I just Googled this. And second of all, I knew it was one of them, but we're just both fools. And second of all, one thing I do want to interject here is that the box model is very useful because it gets you familiar with how something like, let's say, a content block works. So let's say a really typical design is you have 3 content blocks across a screen. Let's just say it's a desktop screen. It's right across the screen. And they're divvied up into, let's say, thirds or approximately thirds. The Flexbox handles the sort of some of the side, and this varies wildly, I'd like to point out. But in general, the Flexbox kind of handles it collapsing in on one another. Like if one goes under the other, it handles like that responsivity. It handles it going across. It handles the alignment. Like, are the 3 blocks together centered? Are they forced left? Are they stretching across the screen? It handles that type of stuff. But the box model is really useful to learn because you learn stuff like this is where the content is. This is where the border is and what that is. This is what the padding is. Margin's different than padding, although they can look very similar visually depending on how your thing is set up. And so the box model really gets you set up. The box model is almost like it's used in the content box. The Flexbox handles the layout, and then CSS grid is sort of like the next generation of this stuff. But like you still need to know padding, margin, all that stuff, which is introduced and like is sort of important to the box model.
Yeah, but I don't know why you would need the box model to use padding and margin. Like it's the same exact functionality in Flexbox. Like I just use margin and padding in Flexbox. Like I to be honest, like I don't see a reason to learn the box model if you have the ability to use Flexbox. I think they can each do the same things, but Flexbox just does it better and easier, and it still gives the same functionality. Like you can still use margin left, margin right, and top.
I think the thing is though is like what I'm saying, I guess, is like we learned box model first, and then we moved to Flexbox. But because we learned box model first, we understood padding, margin, all that. Now the thing is I don't know all the semantics of like how it is like officially, but the padding, margin, and all that stuff, like you're saying, like in Flexbox, is literally the same. It's like padding and margin and all that type of stuff, borders and those type of things, is the same from, as far as I know, from Flexbox to box. Like they're both exactly the same.
Yep.
So all I'm saying is like, to me, the box model allowed me to focus on that. Focus on learning what a margin is, what a border is, what a padding is. And like, it's pretty simplistic, but like, it takes a little bit to kind of get into the groove. And then when I go to Flexbox, all I'm doing is putting the stuff in, and I'm like, hey, why is my title right up against the border of one of my content blocks? Well, I know from my experience with box model that I use padding. Now, you're absolutely correct. You never need to use, or like in that instance that I just said, you don't have to go and be like display block, and then that's why we keep confusing it with box and block model, by the way.
Because it's a block, yeah.
I
honestly think that you can say it both ways. Like
you probably can, but like yeah. I looked it up, and then some like crazy, like, or not crazy, but a bunch of other stuff came out that was not web development. But anyway, all I did was quickly Google it though. So anyway, but the point of the matter is that the box model helped me learn how to manage the stuff in the box. Flexbox helps me move the boxes around. CSS Grid is still kind of a mystery to me. I'm still learning that, so I can't make a full comment on that. But it seems like the next generation for some layouts. But it's almost like if I was, this is a personal classification of this. Flexbox is for layout. Box is for layout of content. Now, I know that some people are going to be like, that's too confusing and this and that, but that's just the way I have it in my head, where I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to use, and again, I'm not actually officially using the display block in these boxes. I'm just saying that by using that originally when I first learned, that allowed me to focus on those fundamentals. Content in middle, padding, like border, margins. And then that allowed me to then go, hey, you know what? Centering, like Mike said, is a real pain in the ass. And then I went to Flexbox. So in my brain, that's how it's set up. Is that the official definition and stuff like that? No, but it's just something to keep in mind that like the padding, the margin and all that is virtually the same, if not the same between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing it definitely gave me was an appreciation for Flexbox and Grid.
Oh, yeah.
So like right now I can legitimately say I really like those things. Whereas if you're just going into the industry and you're just starting with Flexbox, your opinion might be different because you're just starting with that right away. And you won't have that, I guess, not as good base of the box model. Like I don't want to poo-poo on the box model too much because I know
you're using a lot of it still. Like you're still using the padding, the margin, and all that. Those are fundamentals that are in the box model.
But I don't think that those fundamentals are part of the box model, if that makes sense. I think they're just something that we used in the box model.
No, that's what I mean. To be clear, in my brain, because that's how I learned it. Yeah, that's how I like see it. Because I went from like forever in my brain, I'll have like a box module in my head. And then a Flexbox built on top of that. And then if I learn Grid or when I learn Grid on top of that. You know what I mean? I'm not going to forget like where the things come from. So that's just what I mean, I think. Yeah. And I would say if you're a person that's really struggling with Flexbox, my honest opinion is to just try to do a couple of divs. And I know we've already like said div is like a bad word and don't use divs all the time. But if you're just learning, I would try to do a div and just align your content within a box with display block, whatever, display inline block, whatever you need, just to learn those fundamentals if you're struggling at that level. Now, it is pretty simple. I'm sure you will get it pretty quick, but it's just a matter of like, you know, padding isn't something you always think of. Now it's like a muscle memory for me. I know what padding is, but some people might be like, why would I use padding and not margin? Like, why wouldn't I just use margin and have like a nested div? You know what I mean? Like those are the things that like you would weed out if you were just focusing on the older box model, because you might be like, hey, like why don't I have a div and then I have another div for my content inside of that div and then have that other div just be like background is red and then the other div like covers the inside of it and then that's my border. Like people might get into that trap. And so the box model allows you to say, no, I'm going to have one div and I'm going to have a margin property in there. I'm going to have my border properties in there. And if my content is too close to the edges, which is my border in this case, I'm going to put some padding in there. It's just a fundamental thing that you'll use throughout the other models as well. I think that's all I'm saying. That's just the way I see it in my brain, because that's how we learned it.
Yeah, fair enough. It's another way of maybe getting past that, like the basics, fundamental stuff. So yeah, if you're out there and you're having trouble getting those concepts, maybe that's a good way to start it, because that's obviously worked for you, Matt, right? Like, so that's one thing you can definitely say. For me, like I've literally taken it out of my head. Like I don't even know what to do with the box model or anything.
Your way is totally valid. We have different ways of problem solving. Everyone does. Yeah. You know.
I think it's good to have multiple different ways, because some people might respond better to obviously either one. So cool. I think with that, we can move on straight to JavaScript, the last in this pile of stuff. So we started with HTML, like that's the top of the pyramid. Then we went to CSS, the middle, and then JavaScript's kind of the base, the model, the bottom of the pyramid. I don't know if that's actually a good example, because you can definitely still build the pyramid with just HTML and CSS. Like I think there's plenty of sites that you can build that only need those two. And I think that's one of the points that I want to get across today, is that there's so much functionality in both those languages, especially when they're combined together and with the new stuff that's coming out, that you should only be like reaching for JavaScript when you need certain things. Like when you need any functionality outside of navigation, right? Like actual functionality. Like with functionality, what I mean is stuff like DOM manipulation. The DOM is like the actual HTML elements. Like if you need to move an element somewhere else on the page, unless you can do that with responsivity and CSS grid, then you can reach for JavaScript for doing that. If you need an element to appear on the page that wasn't there on initial load because something happened, that's something that JavaScript can do for you. That's what I mean by DOM manipulation. Then there's API interaction in general, fetching, sending, putting, like all the different things you can do with an API. That's all JavaScript, right? So if you have any sort of external data coming to your website that you need to process and then display in a certain way that's kind of like always changing, like it's not just data that's static that's in your HTML page, it's data that like pulling the stocks, right? And you want to display the stocks. That's an always changing data. That's the kind of stuff you're going to need to reach for JavaScript. Anything to do with authentication, right? So if you need to log into using Google or you need to log into your backend service or anything like that, all of that has to be done with JavaScript because you need to be able to send the right information, receive the right information, and then process it to put you somewhere else, right? You can actually do authentication with PHP as well. We're not going to get into PHP in this 3. And maybe that is kind of a slight against it because PHP can do a lot, but and you can kind of use it sometimes in lieu of JavaScript. But the modern age development is moving towards a more JavaScript side of things because it kind of takes out one extra element for you to learn. Because even if you know PHP, if you want to be a full stack developer, you're going to need to know JavaScript. And nowadays, if you want to be a full stack developer and develop your own stuff, you can kind of do it with just these 3. And you don't even need to reach for PHP if you don't want to because of Node.js and all that. And I'll talk about that in a second. There's stuff like interactive maps. So anytime you see a Google map, that's using JavaScript to be you'd be able to pull it around, you'd be able to add markers to it, you'd be able to get directions and stuff like that. That's all done with JavaScript. Any sort of 3D intense animations. Not that I would recommend using that too often, to be honest, because like Matt was saying, he had trouble with the stuttering little slide in and out. If you're doing a 3D animation on a site that is required to be accessed by a general public, like for instance, a government website, you're probably leaning towards the wrong thing. Like you don't want to be showing the globe spinning for no reason, cranking up everyone's battery and phones and stuff like that. There should be a very important reason why you're reaching for stuff like this. Like you shouldn't just reach for stuff for no reason. It's another kind of little topic. Camera and micro. That's
sort of like, sorry, just to jump in really quick. It's sort of like the difference between, do you need the globe to spin or are you working on something like an AutoCAD drawing? Because some of those can be embedded in web pages. Yep. It's sort of like you wouldn't embed an AutoCAD drawing, a 3D image of the globe or some crazy thing. You wouldn't embed that in a page as eye candy. But you would embed it in a page if it was a class about AutoCAD. So kind of look at your use case and be like, well, I literally need this AutoCAD thing. Even though, you could say, well, it's just a GIF or it's just this image that's being animated. It's not quite an AutoCAD. Right. But what if it is, like you said, a public government website and there's people coming in from Android KitKat or something? You're like, it ain't going to work well for them. And so you have to consider that.
Absolutely. Exactly. So you have to consider your audience. A lot of this stuff, like when I kind of do the logic and the basic functionality and the requirements gathering for a project, one of the biggest things is the audience. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but regardless, it's kind of important, especially with the JavaScript side of things, like what you're pulling for. When you're building something and your audience is very specifically, like, for instance, developers, the tools that you can reach for are very, very different. And very, very much in terms of like, can I reach for some of the newer technologies? Developers usually have newer browsers, so I can, definitely screw block model there. Like definitely, anything that's supported in the latest browsers, I can use 100%. Like I don't care about Internet Explorer. But if you're reaching for, the general population and you need everyone to be able to have the same experience, the technologies that you can use start to dwindle down like immediately. So like some libraries won't work. Some of this stuff won't work. Like for instance, I had recently an issue with I have to support Android 5. Android 5 web views specifically don't support lets and consts. So let and const is a variable type in JavaScript that's been supported for a long time, but Android 5 doesn't support it. So if you have a let or a const, it'll just crash. The app won't run if you're relying on JavaScript. So I just have to use vars for that. Then there's a bunch of other stuff that it doesn't support as well. It uses like get user media, like to get camera and microphone access is different on the older stuff. So there's a lot of like backwards compatibility stuff that I have to do to be able to support it. And it's a very different consideration in my head. Like as soon as I know that I'm working on older systems, I'm like, okay, I have to switch off my like, oh, let's reach for the best and latest and greatest. I have to go back and reach for old JavaScript, like old stuff that I was working on 6-7 years ago, and just do that, or like older versions of jQuery, because even newer versions of jQuery will kind of fail in some cases. So that is a really important concept to get across, because when you're first starting out, when you're first building stuff, you're kind of usually reaching for the latest and greatest. But when you're in a production environment and you're told, hey, we need to build this application, all the laptops that our industry workers have are Windows 98 based, you're like, okay, well now I'm working on Internet Explorer 6, and you're going to go down a deep rabbit hole of what you can and cannot use. And those decisions will have extreme ramifications on the actual technologies that you can build. That's for sure. I already mentioned like camera and microphone access. That's all JavaScript side. So if you want to display, something, or, do some face tracking or something like that, that's fully JavaScript. You can't do that with CSS or HTML. Any sort of canvas drawing. So any like, if you want to do, like Matt was mentioning before, you can do animations on a canvas. You can do a lot of other stuff with canvases as well. Any of that stuff, that's JavaScript driven. And again, you got to reach for that. And there's like a million other things that JavaScript can do that CSS and HTML can't do. But the main point that I want to make is that you need to know that you need these functionalities to reach for it. Like if you just have a site that's just information heavy and has a bunch of like, information aspects to it and maybe a contact form, that's not necessarily a reason to use JavaScript for every little thing, right? You can use HTML and CSS for 99% of that site. Now the contact form, arguably, yes, it can be done with JavaScript or PHP, again, bringing it back to that PHP debate. But for the most part, in a regular business card website, in my opinion, you can kind of get away from using JavaScript completely. Is that, I'm gonna kind of pass that off to you, Matt. Is that a correct statement?
Say the statement again.
Okay, so the statement is, in a regular website, like a regular marketing website, let's say.
So a marketing website, I guess that's what I need boiled down.
A marketing website would be just like about a nice cover page, like a nice home page, and like a contact us page. Essentially just those things, maybe with like a retailer section or something like that. Like, so, just information heavy website.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you can build with just CSS and HTML? And I'm the only thing that I can think of that you need some sort of programming language, again, between JavaScript and PHP
is the form,
the contact form,
which you don't even really need. You could just list your email.
Correct, exactly.
You could just list your email, list your phone number.
Can you do that with just literally no JS files whatsoever?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I would say even some of the animations and transitions and stuff like this that you would think like, hey, in the polish phase, as we've already mentioned, the hovering, having like the drop shadow change on the text, or have the color change on the text when you're hovering with a mouse, or when you click with your finger while it's still loading, maybe the link changes color or something. Like whatever you want to do at that basic level, yeah, I would say. Now, there's limitations there where at that point you're kind of stuck with static files. Because a lot of CMSs will use, something like PHP or JS or whatever, even though we're not touching on PHP today. Use PHP, JS, or, something else, Node.js, whatever it is, right? Whatever your back end is doing, back databases and the whole shebang. But yes, for what you're saying, yes. And the thing is, with that, is I think that should actually be encouraging to anyone listening to this that's like, I haven't reached that point. I've learned HTML, learned JS, or I've learned HTML, learned CSS. I'm about to learn JS. You can still go out there and make some sites for your portfolio. You can still go out there and enhance your CSS skill. Like I just said, I don't know CSS grid that well. You know, there's always something more to learn, and there's always more stuff coming. So realistically speaking, I mean, with your limited knowledge, or what you think is limited knowledge, you can do it. Like, here's the thing. I don't know, Node.js. I don't really know PHP, but I can still manipulate and work with WordPress. Now, I do know a fair bit about servers. I know about server administration, etc. So I do have that behind me. But the thing is that I think people are too busy sometimes chasing and not busy focused on what they're doing. Like, of course, it's good to have a target to go after. Like, hey, I need to learn JS. Don't just be like, I just use HTML and CSS on all my client sites. It's like, okay, well, there's going to be limitations, There's going to be limitations. We've already talked about those. There's going to be limitations. But the thing is you yourself are not limited to nothing. And I feel like people are like, oh, if I don't have it all, I'm limited to nothing. You're not limited to nothing. You can still do a whole bunch of stuff. You can make business card websites for people. You could put your own templates on GitHub if you want to give them away. You can do it for your portfolio, start putting it on Instagram. You could do whatever it is that you are trying to do within the limitations of your skill, of course. But it's not like there's nothing to be done. And I think that's really important. And it's actually impressive from a technological standpoint that we can do HTML and CSS with no, I would call a JS the logic. It's almost like the little brain, the little processor, right? And yes, there's back-end stuff. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that CSS and HTML are always seen as sort of like, I would almost classify them in my own head as like the static languages, where they're not really being, there's no like if statements and this and that. Yes, I know there's some CSS ifs and stuff you could do, whatever. But the point of the matter is like, for the most part, to me, CSS and HTML are very static. And the fact that you can do so much with something that is so static is really impressive. So, I mean, be creative. It's just like anything else. Be creative. If you could solve a problem with whatever skills you have, I mean, go ahead and do that. If you can force something to work in CSS without hacking it together and it works well, and it the browsers aren't glitching out with it and it works and it's compatible and everything else, I mean, power to you. You know what I mean? So there's 1,000,001 solutions to everything, and just do it. I mean, that's honestly, that's kind of my sentiment there. And because the reason why I mention all this is because JS is such a big hurdle. Like, if you don't know basic programming syntax, and I mean ones that are, or syntax that is across languages, like if statements, like conditional statements, if you don't understand what a variable is, if you don't understand how integers work and this and that and all the rest of it, if you do not get that stuff, JS is a huge hurdle. Because just like how you had to learn how the DOM flows with HTML, you have to learn how JS works as a concept, how programming languages, not just JS, work as a concept. And then you have to learn the syntax of JS. So if you're stuck, or you're like, hey, I'm just learning JS, this is going to take a while. Yeah, but you're not stuck. You can go and make websites. Yeah, there's limitations. You can go and do it. And then you can always just hit up JS, or start using JS as your skills go and improve. Because I don't know JS all that well. I know it enough. I know like how programming languages generally work and stuff like that. So I have like a leg up, I suppose, there. But I don't use JS every single day. So I don't use it every day. So like, I just don't use it every day. I don't use it every day. So I forget a lot of this stuff. But that, I think, is the hardest part. Is learning like that syntax. Learning that, what would you call it, Mike? It's not the JS syntax. That's the problem. It's
programming. Like you nailed it. Like learning, getting your head around a language or programming as a concept is difficult. The initial hurdle is an actual hurdle. Like it's legit. Like you don't understand, and all of a sudden you're jumping and you're like, oh my God, I understand now. And then after that initial hurdle, everything is kind of like a little bit downhill, and it's more understandable. It's not easy by any means, but it's way more understandable. But you have to have that aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yes,
everyone that
that's a
I've
good way to
talked
put it.
to, everyone that I've talked to in programming has had that like, oh, okay, that's how programming is. And then everything kind of starts going into place. But until you have that moment, it's difficult, like really difficult, to the point where like I had a few people in my university courses, my programming, like, software engineering university courses, by the end of the courses, they still did not know how to program, which is mind-boggling, right? Because they were in a software engineering program, but they just could never get past that hurdle.
It's because they memorize, right? Like in school, it's possible if you're good at it. Not in all cases, but it's possible to memorize enough to pass or even do good.
Yep. Exactly. And rely on like group projects, right? Like group projects, we always split up essentially into the people that could program and the people that could write. And then like, so the people that would program, and then the people that would write would just do the documentation side of everything. And then the people that would program would actually do the project. So that's always like essentially 99% of the projects were always like that. Only one time in my, or a couple of, maybe like 2 or 3 times in my university career did I have a partner that could actually program. Which was interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, it was an interesting concept. But like I said, like it's just not that initial hurdle. It has to click in your head, and it's really difficult to describe that to someone that's either it's already clicked or it hasn't clicked before. But it's one of those things where you just kind of have to grind it out and understand it and try and get better at it until it clicks, and then it's like, okay, now I can do it. Like now I can learn, now I can understand, and everything like that. You just have to grind out that initial start.
It's a good comparison if you take it still in tech, but you take it out of programming. It's the same thing as IT. So you may not understand the intricacies of a company's or of a computer's issues. You might not understand the intricacies of you might not even understand the hardware that's in there. Like you might not be informed that it like what GPU is in there, what CPU, whatever. But I mean, I'm sure it's the same for Mike, because we worked in IT. It comes to a point where someone has a problem and you have 2 or 3 potential solutions in your head. And whether they're all wrong or whether they're all right or whether whatever, the fact that you have those like estimates or educated solutions in your head means that you've kind of quote unquote made it. Like it's like a muscle memory now. And it's the same thing with programming, where you might be like, oh, I can put an if here, blah, 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 and do this, do that. And the thing is like you can refactor later and whatever. But the point is like if you can come up with a solution in your head without being like, well, do I use ifs to, like, that's the big question, right? Like, do I use ifs to control this button? That should, like, once the solution becomes, oh, like, should I use some ifs here? Should I use this here? Should I use this here? Like, you have a bunch of, like, ideas in your head that then you're like, oh, yeah, boom. Like, you kind of get it. You kind of get the idea.
Exactly. So with that, we're just going to round it out a little bit and finish this off. Turn into a longer episode than I was expecting, but that's good. It's covering like 3 major topics, and obviously we haven't covered them in any like depth. I just wanted to give an overview of what each one is responsible for and why we learn them this way, so that it can kind of give you, the person that's starting out, or maybe a person that's a little bit more seasoned, back to thinking about the basics. And instead of thinking about every little framework or every little technology, you start thinking more basic, and that like we talked about earlier with the keep it simple stupid will make your applications better. But with JavaScript, there's a lot that it can do. Like there's a reason why I recommend learning JavaScript, is because it's not just like a web programming language anymore. There's server-side JavaScript with Node.js, Matt mentioned a couple times. And there's also a bunch of stuff that you can do with native applications. So you can get a native application like iOS or Android to run JavaScript and act and feel almost exactly like a regular, Kotlin or Java or Swift or Objective-C programmed application. Like stuff like Cordova, Electron, React Native all give you the ability to do that. And learning JavaScript, again, gives you the interoperability to do tooling, to do native apps, to do websites, to do business, applications, intranet applications. It's so flexible, and there's so much room for it to grow even further, that it's kind of like it's the end state of a web developer. Now, someone might attack me for that or whatever, but like in my opinion, if you know JavaScript, you have a good and bright future, right? Like it's one of those things that will propel you, and the better you get at it, the easier it'll be for you to land jobs and create applications and all that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I wanted to end with it, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. But it is an important part of the web development ecosphere, but it shouldn't be something that you reach for on every little feature. Like there should be a natural progression of like, can HTML do this? No. Can CSS do this? No. Okay, I'll do it in JavaScript. Right? That's kind of the hierarchy that I wanted to instill in this, but JavaScript is still super important and super powerful. Like the stuff that it can do. And then service workers make it even more powerful. And then like WebAssembly, like there's just so much that it can do. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. We were going to have a little debate at the end here, but we've kind of gone really over time. And I think we'll leave the debate maybe for like either a pre-show or a web news or something like that, because we haven't done one of those in a long time.
Yeah, I still have that one web news. It's just we're still on the fallout of all the craziness that we had with all the, like I said, feast or famine and that type of thing. So this is the fallout of it. Like the show was the cornerstone of the week that we try to always do, and that's what we kind of did. So goal met, I suppose. But speaking of goals, Mike, weekly growth goal. What's the status of yours?
Yeah, so my weekly growth goal was to complete the weekly goals functionality. So like being able to mark a goal as done, being able to delete a goal, and being able to encourage a goal by this week. Now, I haven't fully achieved all three of those functionalities, but I'm almost there. And I also redid the structure of some of my authentication. I also did a bunch of styling. So I did deviate from just that plan. But the good news is that I'm really close, and I have allotted a bunch of time this week to actually not only complete the weekly goal functionality, but to get some sort of beta out to the public of the site. Like my goal for literally up till next Tuesday or Wednesday is to have a link to be able to talk about the site, maybe even in the show, and for people to start trying it out. Like it's going to be really basic. I'm not going to give an overview right now. I'll give an overview during that episode, but don't expect like the moon. But it does have like an authentication and like some interactivity with the community, and it is like community centered. Like everyone will be able to see each other's goals and stuff. So it is a little bit more of an undertaking than I thought it would be, but I did learn a ton from it, and I used Strappy, which was kind of a cool headless CMS tool that I'll definitely reach for in the future. So that was my weekly goal, and my weekly goal for next week, again, is to get that app to you guys.
Cool. My weekly growth goal was to make a move on a couple of domains. I am at a crossroads, so I did a little research, and I learned something. So I can hire a web brokerage or like a domain brokerage service and have them deal with it, and you have to pay them and this and that. But I learned something interesting. So obviously you can find out the owner of a domain by using a whois. Now, I just do the whois, whatever, and a lot of the time now, due to the fact that spam calls have kind of blown out of control, a lot of registrars, as they used to redact the contact information of the person for a fee, a lot of the information seems to be redacted by default. Now, I don't know the laws and stuff behind that. That's up to the registrars. But of the domains that I want, the stuff is redacted. Fair enough. So I thought, okay, I'll use a brokerage thing, but I kind of like know how to look around the internet to find out how to contact somebody, like obviously because I'm on the internet. So I like looked around to try to see if this person had a contact form, just the public stuff. It's not like I'm breaking into anything. Just looking at, does this person have a contact form? Who owns this? What is the path? Because this website was purchased at one point, and like where's the company's at and stuff like this. And I found nothing. And then I looked up at one brokerage service, and they said, we're only going to use public records to determine if we can figure out who this is. And I thought to myself, I don't know whether I want to pay this, because in this particular brokerage service, it's $200 and some odd to pay up front. Then it's 20% commission on top if they get it. But now they do handle the transfer. But I learned something interesting. In the whois, you can determine the registrar generally of the domain. Is it Network Solutions? Is it GoDaddy? Is it whoever? Here's the thing. A lot of these services, a lot of these registrars have their own whois. When I went to that particular registrar's whois, because there's two websites I wanted. One was on GoDaddy actually, and one was on Network Solutions. I can contact the domain owner via those specific whois. Now, Network Solutions, I've only looked briefly because it's a secondary site that I may or may not want, but I think I have to pay to make an offer. It's called like a quick offer or something. I don't know whether I can just contact them. I'm not sure on that. Like I said, very, 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 very brief look. But the GoDaddy one, I can just message them. and I assume that goes right to their GoDaddy account. Maybe it emails them. I'm not actually sure. Like I said, I just took a brief look even at that one because I just discovered it. So I'm at a bit of a crossroads. So like I'm progressing, but I've never tried to acquire a domain like this before. And if it was for a client, I would just hire a brokerage service because then I can just tell the client a price, right? Rather than me digging for hours and all the rest of it. But since this is for me and not for a client, I don't know. So I made progress. I just don't know. I don't know what to do because I want to make a half decent offer on the thing. But at the same time, I don't want to like have a fair bit of that offer be taken by, like, I don't want to like pay almost double or whatever. I'm not going to get into the numbers in brokerage fees as well. Now there is the whole thing of like, if you pay them, they may not transfer it to you. And so the brokerage handles all that and blah, blah, blah. So like, I'm really kind of on the fence. Maybe I'll try to contact the person and then have, if they do respond, then hire the brokerage to handle the transfer because they'll accept whatever. I don't know. So I'm at a weird crossroads. It's a simplistic thing. Right? Obviously, it's like, would you like to buy this domain? Yes. Okay. Well, someone else owns it. They may resell it to you or sell it to you. It's pretty simplistic, but I'm just trying to figure out what the best path is because I think this is one of those things where I could pay a lot for convenience because it's so simplistic. And I could get myself in like sort of a financial hole. Not like I'm spending $1 million or anything, but I get myself into like a financial hole where a bill was supposed to be 100. Now it's like 800. So I don't know. That's where I'm at. So I don't know if any of you guys have experience with purchasing domains. Please let me know. Like, please let me know what your experience was. Whether you suggest a particular brokerage, whether you suggest using this like Whois trick, which I had no idea existed, for like using specific Whois. But yeah, if anyone has any ideas or whatever, please let me know. I'm not gonna divulge the domain names because I don't want people to go after them. For the obvious reason, but yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at. So if you have anything, like any information on that front, please let me know in our socials, Twitter, whatever, Instagram, and all that. But if you're interested, and if you're still interested in the show and you want to support us, and you want us to make future episodes, you can please check us out and support us on patreon.com/htmlthings. Check out the tiers, give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Sean from RabbitWorks JavaScript on youtube.com/RabbitWorks JavaScript, Garrick from Local Path Computing and Web Design on localpathcomputing.com, Ryan Gatchell from Blue Black Digital on blueblackdigital.com, Chris from Self-Made Web Designer on selfmadewebdesigner.com, Tim from The Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, DL Ford from dlford.io, Bib Hashdash from 9block Media on 9blockmedia.com, and Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And we are signing off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.